The blind German shepherd in a white bandana had never met the little girl, until one moment on a San Francisco street changed both their lives forever. What happened next made the millionaire who owned him cry in front of strangers. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The morning fog of San Francisco still lingered over the bay like a silk veil, softening the edges of the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance. It was early spring, and the air carried the mingled scents of salt water and freshly brewed coffee from the cafes that dotted the waterfront. The city was just waking up. Cable cars rattled along the tracks on California Street, and gulls cried overhead as fishing boats returned with their morning catch. Michael Turner walked briskly along the Embarcadero, his tailored charcoal coat swaying lightly in the cool breeze. At 45, Michael was a man who embodied success in every visible way. Broad-shouldered, over 6 feet tall, with silver just beginning to touch the edges of his dark hair. His eyes were a deep, steady brown, the kind that had convinced countless investors to trust him with their fortunes. In the world of finance, Michael had built an empire: real estate, hedge funds, tech ventures, all wrapped in the kind of wealth that afforded him a penthouse overlooking the bay and the freedom to never check the price tag of anything. Yet beneath the polished exterior lay a hollowness that wealth had never managed to fill. 5 years earlier, his wife Sarah had been killed in a car accident on a rain-slicked highway in Napa Valley. Sarah had been the warmth to his steel, a tall, graceful woman with a cascade of auburn hair, an easy laugh, and the rare ability to make strangers feel like old friends. She'd been a social worker, devoting her life to people society often forgot. Her loss had carved a permanent absence in Michael's life, one he had tried to fill with longer work hours, charitable donations, and eventually a retreat into solitude. The only constant companion left to him was Duke, the German shepherd who padded silently at his side that morning. Duke was 8 years old, a strong, regal dog whose once keen amber eyes had turned cloudy after an accident 3 years earlier. The injury had left him completely blind, but his other senses had sharpened to near perfection. Around his head was a neatly tied white cloth bandana, a habit Michael had started after the accident, not to hide the blindness, but as a kind of badge of dignity for the dog who had once served in a search and rescue unit. Duke moved with careful precision, his head tilting slightly as he caught scents or listened to distant sounds, his powerful frame still exuding the quiet confidence of his working days. Michael's mornings often followed a predictable rhythm: a walk along the waterfront with Duke, a coffee at his favorite cafe, then the short drive to his private office. But on this particular morning, as the sun began to burn away the fog, something different caught Duke's attention. The dog paused mid-step, his ears pricking toward the faint scratch of charcoal on paper, the whisper of brush on canvas. Michael followed the pull of the leash and noticed a small figure seated on the low stone wall that bordered the walkway. It was a girl, no more than 9 years old, her slender frame wrapped in a faded denim jacket that seemed a size too big. She sat in a lightweight wheelchair, a box of colored pastels balanced on her lap, sketching the blurred outlines of the Bay Bridge. Her hair was a soft chestnut brown, pulled into a loose braid that trailed over one shoulder, and her skin was pale, almost translucent, as if sunlight rarely touched it. Despite the cool air, there was a sheen of effort on her forehead. Her legs were thin, almost fragile, their position in the chair suggesting more than just casual rest. The way she moved told Michael what her appearance confirmed. She wasn't simply sitting. She could not stand. This was Lily Harper, born with a congenital bone disorder. She had spent her life between hospitals, home care, and the occasional rare venture into the outside world. Her condition made walking impossible, and even sitting for long periods could be exhausting. Yet there was something about the way she worked on her drawing, intent, focused, unflinching, that spoke of a resilience far older than her years. A few feet away sat a small folding tin box where a handwritten sign in looping letters read, "Art for my mom's hospital bills. Any amount helps." Michael's gaze softened. He had seen street artists before, but there was nothing calculated about this setup. It was earnest, almost painfully so. Duke tugged forward again, his movements purposeful. Michael let the leash play out, curious. The German shepherd approached the girl, his nose lifting toward her scent. Lily looked up, startled at first, then smiled. A quick, unguarded smile that lit her face. "Hello there," she said softly, holding out her hand instinctively. Duke stepped closer, lowering his head into her lap, with the kind of gentleness that only came from deep understanding. His breath stirred the pastels in their tray, and Lily laughed quietly, brushing her fingers along his broad head, feeling the texture of his short, dense fur beneath the white bandana. He's wearing a scarf," she observed, tilting her head to study it. "It's a bandana," Michael replied, stepping up beside them. "White, to match his dignity. His name's Duke. He's blind." Lily's hand froze for a second, then continued stroking the dog's neck. "Blind? He found me without even seeing me?" Michael smiled faintly. "He doesn't need eyes to find what matters." For a moment, the three of them stayed like that, man, child, and dog, while the city moved around them. The sound of trolley bells, the splash of water against the pier, the chatter of early tourists faded into the background. Michael felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years, an unbidden connection, fragile but undeniable. It wasn't just the way Duke had gone straight to her, or the way she'd welcomed him without hesitation. It was that same warmth Sarah used to bring into any room, the ability to see the person before the circumstance. Lily looked up at Michael again, her eyes the shade of gray clouds before a storm, brightened by the faintest glimmer of curiosity. "Does Duke like art?" Michael glanced down at the German shepherd, who had settled his head more firmly into her lap, a low sigh escaping his chest. "He likes people who make the world better," he said. The girl smiled again, and Michael noticed her hands, thin but steady, smudged faintly with blue and green pastel dust. She returned to her drawing, one hand absently resting against Duke's head, as if the dog's presence was the most natural thing in the world. Michael found himself lingering, the minutes stretching, the cool air tinged with the scent of salt and the faint sweetness of cinnamon from a bakery nearby. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, he didn't want to walk away. And that was how, on an ordinary morning by the bay, Michael Turner met Lily Harper, and how Duke, the blind German shepherd with the white bandana, found the girl without sight, without hesitation, and placed his head in her lap as though they had always belonged to the same story. The late morning sun had broken through the last of the fog, bathing San Francisco's Fisherman's Wharf in a golden light that sparkled on the restless water. The sounds of the pier rose in a layered chorus, gulls calling overhead, the creak of wooden masts, the slap of waves against barnacled pilings, and the chatter of vendors selling crab chowder and steaming bread bowls. Michael Turner walked slowly along the edge of the pier, Duke at his side, his white bandana fluttering faintly in the breeze. They had met Lily only an hour before, but something about that meeting pulled at Michael's mind. He had told himself they would simply pass through, yet here they were again, scanning the crowd for the small figure in the wheelchair. He found her at the far end of the wharf, in a patch of sunlight that caught in her braid and set the strands aglow like copper. Lily was turned slightly toward the water, her pastels resting on her lap. She wasn't drawing this time. Instead, she was tapping lightly on the edge of her pastel tin, her fingers moving with a precision that surprised him. The rhythm was not random, soft, deliberate, a pattern that seemed to echo the hush and rush of the waves against the pier's wooden legs. Michael stopped a few paces away, letting the sound wash over him. Duke, as if sensing the moment, sat down at his side, head tilted toward the water. "That's not just tapping," Michael said after a moment. "That's music." Lily glanced up, her gray eyes bright with the satisfaction of being understood. "I like to match the sound of the water. If you listen long enough, it has a beat. You just have to find it." Michael crouched to her level, studying her small hands, delicate but steady, their fingertips dusted faintly with pigment. "Do you play an instrument?" She shook her head. "Number?" "My mom says we can't afford one right now, but the water's free and it never runs out of songs." The mention of her mother tugged at Michael's curiosity. "Would she mind if I met her?" Lily's face brightened. "She's working at the cafe down the street. I can call her." She pulled a small, well-used phone from her jacket pocket, the case decorated with hand-drawn flowers under clear tape. Rachel Harper arrived 10 minutes later, her pace brisk despite the lunchtime crowd. She was in her early 30s, of average height, with wavy dark hair pulled into a loose bun, and the kind of tired eyes that come from too many late nights and early mornings. Her apron still bore faint coffee stains from the morning rush, and her hands, though quick to straighten Lily's jacket, trembled slightly. Whether from fatigue or worry, Michael couldn't tell. "Mr. Turner?" she asked, her voice polite but cautious, the way someone speaks when they've learned not to expect much kindness from strangers. "Michael, please," he said, extending his hand. "I met Lily earlier and, well, I'd like to invite you both to lunch, my treat." Rachel hesitated, glancing at her daughter, then back at him. "That's kind, but—" "Please," Michael interrupted gently. "It's just lunch. And I think Duke's already decided Lily is his friend." At the sound of his name, Duke stepped forward, pressing his nose against Rachel's hand in polite canine greeting. She smiled despite herself. "All right, just lunch." Michael led them to a quiet restaurant with a view of the bay, one of those tucked-away places that locals guarded like secrets. Inside, sunlight spilled through large windows onto worn wooden tables, polished smooth by years of conversation. The air smelled faintly of lemon and rosemary. As they ate, conversation moved easily, mostly between Lily and Michael, with Duke stretched out at her feet. Michael learned that Rachel worked double shifts at the cafe to cover both rent and medical bills, that Lily had been in and out of hospitals since she was 2, and that their lives, though difficult, were anchored by an unshakable closeness. After lunch, Michael offered to drive them home. Rachel politely declined, explaining they lived in a small apartment only a few blocks away. Instead, Michael suggested something else. "Why don't you both come by my place for a little while? I have something I think Lily should see." Rachel's brows lifted in surprise. "What is it?" "A piano," Michael replied. "It's been sitting untouched for years." They agreed, and half an hour later, Michael was unlocking the door to his penthouse, a high-ceilinged space filled with clean lines and expansive views of the bay. Yet, for all its elegance, it felt still, almost museum-like, as though it had been waiting for laughter to return. Lily's eyes roamed the space with quiet wonder. Duke, meanwhile, was alert, his nose twitching as he moved deliberately toward a corner of the living room. Without hesitation, he turned and stopped beside a glossy black upright piano. His tail thumped once against the wall. "You see," Michael said, smiling. "He knows." Lily wheeled herself closer, her fingers reaching out to touch the smooth keys. "It's beautiful." "Go on," Michael encouraged. "Try it." Her first press of the keys was tentative, but the soft, resonant note filled the room like a drop of water in a still pond. She pressed another, then another, her eyes half closing, as though listening for something only she could hear. After a moment, she began to play a sequence of notes that echoed the rhythm she had tapped on the pastel tin by the wharf. Michael stood motionless, watching as Duke settled beside her chair, his head resting on his paws, his breathing steady in time with the music. The sound seemed to shift the very air in the room. The penthouse, long accustomed to silence, now held a pulse again, a fragile, tentative heartbeat born from a child's hands on forgotten keys. Michael felt something inside him loosen, a tension he hadn't even known he was carrying. In that moment, he understood. Lily wasn't just filling the space with sound, she was bringing life back into it, the same way she had unknowingly filled a space in him he thought was permanently empty. The afternoon sky over San Francisco was painted in shades of pale gold and soft lavender, the kind of light that made the city seem almost tender. A gentle breeze drifted in from the bay, carrying the mingled scents of eucalyptus from the nearby park and the briny tang of seawater. Michael had suggested they take a walk in Marina Green Park, a wide, grassy expanse that overlooked the water with a view of sailboats drifting lazily beyond the breakwater. It was a rare moment of calm, far from the usual rush of traffic and business meetings, and Michael found himself walking more slowly than usual, matching the pace of Lily's wheelchair as Duke padded alongside. As they followed the path curving toward the edge of the lawn, Michael's mind drifted to the first time he had seen Duke. It had been nearly 3 years ago, on a late autumn morning, when he had driven north through Napa County on an errand that had nothing to do with animals. He'd been on his way to meet a vintner about investing in a small winery when a sudden storm forced him to take a side road. That's when he passed the old farm, its fence sagging, the yard littered with rusted equipment, the fields overgrown with weeds. Near the barn, he'd caught sight of a German shepherd lying in the mud, ribs faintly visible beneath a matted coat, eyes clouded with a whiteness that made Michael's heart clench. The dog had stood shakily as Michael approached, one ear twitching at the sound of his voice, nose lifting to catch his scent. He'd learned later that Duke had once been part of a search and rescue training program, praised for his precision and focus, until an accident in a collapsed shed had robbed him of his sight. The farm where he'd been left had neither the resources nor the will to care for a blind working dog. Most would have seen him as useless. Michael had seen something else, a survivor with quiet dignity. He had brought Duke home that day, cleaned and fed him, and over the months that followed, learned that the loss of vision had done nothing to dim the dog's instincts. Back in the present, Michael glanced down at Duke walking slightly ahead, his posture alert but unhurried. Lily was telling him about her favorite sound in the city. "The foghorn," she said, "because it's like the bay is talking to you." Her voice carried that bright, matter-of-fact tone children use when speaking of things they love, as if it were the most natural truth in the world. They reached a part of the park where the paved path curved toward the street, and a few cyclists passed by on the designated bike lane. Michael was about to comment on the view when it happened, so quickly he almost didn't process it. Duke's ears shot forward, his head jerking toward the sound of something coming fast from behind. In an instant, the dog lunged sideways, his body pressing against Lily's wheelchair with enough force to push it a full foot back from the edge of the curb. A cyclist flashed past, no bell, no warning, his speed reckless for the narrow lane. Michael's breath caught as he realized the front wheel of the bike had been inches from Lily's footrests. He was at her side in a heartbeat, one hand gripping the chair, the other steadying her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice sharper than intended. Lily blinked up at him, more surprised than frightened. "I'm fine. Duke?" He knew. Michael's gaze fell to the dog, who stood between the wheelchair and the road, his head high, his white bandana stirring in the wind. Even blind, Duke had read the threat before Michael had, guided only by the vibration of approaching wheels and the rush of displaced air. Rachel, who had been walking a few paces behind, hurried up, her face pale. "I saw that." He pulled her back just in time. She knelt beside Duke, rubbing the base of his neck. "You're a hero, aren't you?" Michael crouched down as well, resting his hand on the dog's shoulder. "He's done things like this before," he admitted. "Even without his eyes, he sees. I've always thought it was instinct, but maybe it's something more." They resumed their walk more slowly, the incident lingering in Michael's thoughts. Duke's intervention had been so precise, so unhesitating, it felt less like luck and more like a gift. When they returned to Michael's penthouse, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting the bay in shades of silver and rose. Lily asked if she could play the piano again, and Michael agreed, watching as Duke settled beside her once more. She began with soft, tentative notes, then shifted into the rhythm she'd tapped out by the wharf the day before. Duke's ears twitched subtly, his breathing sinking to her tempo, and Michael saw something click in his mind. He stepped forward, leaning against the piano's edge. "Lily," he said carefully, "do you feel different when you play and Duke's here?" She nodded. "It's like he knows when I'm getting the rhythm right. I can feel it in the way he breathes. It's like we're talking without words." Michael glanced at Rachel, who was standing by the window, her arms loosely crossed but her eyes fixed on her daughter. "What if," he said slowly, "we use that? The way you connect with him. The music, his instincts. What if it could be more than just playing?" Rachel's brows furrowed. "You mean, like therapy?" "Exactly," Michael replied. Duke was trained to guide, to respond to subtle cues. You respond to music. What if the two of you together could train your body in ways regular therapy hasn't? Lily tilted her head, curiosity sparking in her eyes. "So Duke would help me move?" Michael nodded. "Not in the usual way a guide dog helps, but maybe in a way that works for you. Music you can feel, and Duke responding so you can feel his responses, like a loop between you. Rachel hesitated, but there was no skepticism in her expression, only the cautious hope of a parent who had seen too many failed promises. "If it's safe, we can try." Michael smiled faintly, looking at Duke, who had lifted his head at the sound of his name. "Safe is one thing I know he'll make sure of." As the evening deepened and the first lights of the city blinked on, Michael knew they had stumbled onto something neither medicine nor money had given them before, the possibility of a path forward born from the bond between a blind dog and a child who had never walked. The morning air was crisp and carried the briny perfume of the Pacific. Low clouds hovered just above the horizon, the water beyond the piers shifting in slow silver swells. Michael had spent the last week searching for the right space for his experiment, somewhere Lily could hear the ocean and play without the distractions of the city. He finally found it, a small recording studio nestled between an old lighthouse keeper's cottage and a surfboard repair shop in a quieter stretch of the Marina District. The place was run by Paul Whitaker, a tall, lean man in his late 50s whose weathered face carried the deep creases of years spent at sea. A former jazz pianist turned sound engineer, Paul had a salt and pepper beard and the easy, patient demeanor of someone who had learned to listen more than he spoke. He agreed to rent the space to Michael for the afternoons, curious about this unusual therapy plan involving a blind German shepherd and a wheelchair-bound girl. The studio itself was modest, softly lit, with walls lined in acoustic panels and one large window that faced the open bay. Even with the glass shut, the distant rhythm of waves and the occasional call of gulls seeped into the room like part of the music itself. Michael had a piano moved in, its polished mahogany surface reflecting the filtered light from the sea. In the corner, Duke's bed, a thick fleece-lined mat, was placed where he could rest while still close to Lily. The first sessions were tentative. Lily would wheel herself to the piano, her small hands resting on the keys while Duke settled beside her. Michael would encourage her to start with the patterns she'd played in his penthouse, the ones that mirrored the ebb and flow of the tide. Duke, as if attuned to her every note, would occasionally emit a soft whine or shift his weight, like a living metronome. Rachel sat quietly through these sessions, her dark hair pulled back, hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching her daughter with the protective gaze of someone who had been let down too many times by promises that went nowhere. Over the weeks, something remarkable began to happen. Lily's posture changed when she played, her back straighter, her breathing deeper, her arms moving with a newfound fluidity. Michael noticed she seemed more willing to lean forward in her chair, placing more weight on her legs without prompting. Then, one gray afternoon, as the wind rattled the studio windows and the bay rolled under a steel sky, it happened. Lily was halfway through a slow, swelling melody, one she had begun to call the sea's voice, when Duke suddenly gave a sharp, perfectly timed bark in rhythm with the music. Startled but smiling, Lily laughed and, without thinking, gripped the piano bench to push herself upright. Her legs trembled, uncertain, but they held. She stood for a count of 3, 4, 5 seconds before sitting back down, her cheeks flushed, eyes wide. Rachel's breath hitched, audibly, and she pressed her hand to her mouth. Tears welled and spilled freely down her face. Michael, frozen for a heartbeat, felt the tight band around his chest snap and give way to something fierce and bright. He didn't speak, didn't dare break the fragile magic of the moment. Duke lay still now, head on his paws, but his ears were tilted toward Lily as if waiting for the next cue. It didn't happen every session. Some days Lily could stand for several seconds, others not at all. But the fact that it had happened more than once was enough to send a current of hope through all 3 of them. Word, however, had a way of traveling in this city. Paul, meaning well, mentioned the miracle music to a friend, and within a week, a local blogger had written about the little girl who stood with a blind dog song. The post spread quickly, picked up by larger outlets hungry for a feel-good headline. Within days, reporters appeared outside the studio, cameras ready, calling out questions whenever Michael arrived with Lily and Rachel. Some wanted to document the sessions, others hinted at skepticism, questioning whether the whole thing was staged. A particularly persistent health correspondent from a local station suggested on air that There may be more financial or publicity motives than medical merit here. Michael, who had spent years cultivating a reputation for discretion, found the attention both invasive and infuriating. Rachel grew tense under the scrutiny. "This isn't why we're here," she told Michael one evening after a session. "Lily's not a story. She's a person." "I know," Michael said, running a hand through his hair. "I'm going to handle it." But before he could devise a plan to shield them from the growing storm of attention, another complication appeared. It was late afternoon, the tide pulling out and the light thinning into amber, when Michael heard a voice behind him as he locked up the studio. "Excuse me, are you Michael Turner?" He turned to see a man in his mid-30s standing a few feet away, dressed in a heavy brown jacket, worn jeans, and work boots caked with the residue of long travel. He had broad shoulders, short-cropped dark hair, and the kind of face that looked like it had been carved by years of outdoor labor, sunburnt in places, wind-chapped in others. His eyes, however, were a piercing green, steady and searching. "My name's Daniel Harper," the man said, his voice low but urgent. "I'm Lily's father." Michael's first instinct was disbelief. "Her father?" Daniel nodded, shifting the duffel bag on his shoulder. "I've been working up in Alaska, remote fisheries, oil rigs, places where it's easy to lose touch if you're not careful. Rachel and we lost contact years ago. I didn't even know—" He paused, swallowing hard. "I didn't know my daughter was sick, or that she couldn't walk." Michael studied him for a long moment, measuring his words, the sincerity in his face. There was a weary honesty in the way Daniel stood, not defensive, not entitled, just a man who had spent too many years far from the people who mattered. "Rachel doesn't know I'm here yet," Daniel admitted. "I came straight from the airport. I just want to see her. Please." The wind off the bay cut sharp between them, carrying the salt and the faint sound of a foghorn. Michael exhaled slowly. "This isn't something I can decide," he said. "You'll need to talk to Rachel." Daniel nodded once, as if bracing himself for a storm more daunting than any Alaskan winter. The following evening, the air along the waterfront carried a sharper chill than usual, the kind that hinted autumn was about to lay its hand on San Francisco. The sky was streaked with coral and gold, fading toward the indigo that would swallow the bay after sunset. Michael stood outside the small cafe where Rachel had agreed to meet, his hands in the pockets of his dark wool coat. Inside, he could see Rachel at a table by the window, her posture straight, her hair loose around her shoulders, a mug cradled between her hands. Across from her sat Daniel Harper. Daniel looked cleaner, rested, a change from the travel-worn man Michael had met the day before. His jacket was gone, replaced by a simple flannel shirt, and the wary tension in his shoulders seemed to have eased into something more open. When Michael stepped inside, Rachel glanced up, her eyes unreadable but not hostile. "Michael," she said, motioning to the seat between them. "You remember Daniel." "I do," Michael replied, taking the seat. They spoke cautiously at first, the way people do when navigating years of absence and uncertainty. Daniel explained his years in Alaska, not just the work, but the isolation, the storms that cut off communication for months, the injury that left him recovering in a remote fishing village with no phone service. He wasn't making excuses. The way he spoke carried both regret and an acceptance of his own failings. "I didn't know about her condition until I got back to the mainland," Daniel said, glancing toward the window, as if seeing Lily's face in the reflection. "If I had, I would have come running." For the first time since he'd walked in, Rachel's expression wavered. She looked at him not as a stranger who had returned, but as the man she had once trusted her life with. His voice was rough, but not defensive, just raw, like truth stripped of everything else. Her fingers tightened around her mug, and her eyes glistened. She drew in a shaky breath, stood, and walked around the table. Without a word, she leaned down, wrapping her arms around Daniel's broad shoulders. He froze for half a second before returning the embrace, his hands pressing gently against her back. Her voice was muffled against his shirt, trembling. "You don't know how much I missed you. How many nights I wished you were here." Daniel's arms tightened and he murmured, "I'm here now. I'm not leaving again." Michael turned his gaze to the window, giving them the space they needed. The next afternoon, Rachel brought Lily to the studio without explaining to her exactly why. Michael and Daniel were already waiting inside. When Lily entered, she froze at the sight of the man standing near the piano. Her eyes darted from his face to Rachel's, searching for confirmation. "Sweetheart," Rachel said gently, kneeling beside her. "This is your father." Lily's lips trembled. She gripped the armrest of her wheelchair, her voice a whisper. "Dad?" Daniel dropped to his knees instantly, his large hands reaching for hers. "It's me, Lily. I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." For a moment, she just stared at him, as if trying to bridge the years in a single heartbeat. Then the tears came, spilling fast and hot down her cheeks. She reached out, and Daniel gathered her into his arms, holding her as if he could somehow make up for all the days he had missed. Her sobs shook them both, but he only pressed her closer, his voice low and steady. "I'm here now. I love you more than anything." When Lily finally pulled back, her eyes were still wet, but lit with something softer. Relief. She gave him a small, almost shy smile before turning to Pat Duke, who had quietly come to rest his head against her leg. She began to play a gentle tune on the piano, and halfway through, without hesitation, she gripped the bench and stood. Daniel's breath caught, and his eyes shone as he looked from his daughter to the dog who had helped make this possible. That evening, as the three adults lingered in the studio while Lily played, Daniel cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he began, looking from Rachel to Michael. "Lily's my daughter, but I can't ignore what you've done for her, Michael. You and Duke. I'd like you to be part of her life officially, as a co-guardian, not instead of me, with me, and Rachel." Rachel's eyes flicked to Michael's, searching, but there was no hesitation in his answer. "If that's what you both want, I'd be honored." 2 weeks later, on a soft, salt-scented evening, the small crowd gathered by Fisherman's Wharf wasn't there for seafood or souvenirs. Paul Whitaker had set up a modest platform and a sound system borrowed from the studio. Michael had sent out a few invitations, and word had spread in a gentler way this time. Friends, neighbors, people who had cheered Lily on without turning her into a spectacle. Lily wore a pale blue dress that matched the silk ribbon tied in her braid. Beside her, Duke's white bandana had been freshly washed, its fabric rippling slightly in the bay breeze. When Paul introduced her, the audience quieted, and Lily's fingers found their place on the keys. The piece was new, Blue Eyes of the Sea, a name she'd chosen because, as she explained to Michael, "It's the color I imagined Duke's eyes were before he went blind." The melody began softly, like the tide pulling at the shore, then swelled with a brightness that seemed to catch the light itself. Duke, as if sensing the importance, lay perfectly still, ears tuned to every note. Halfway through, Lily rose from the bench. Her knees wavered at first, but she steadied herself, her gaze fixed on the keys. The music didn't falter. The audience seemed to hold its breath as she stood, fully upright now, her hands moving in a dance with the piano, her face alight. She stayed that way until the last chord faded into the sound of the real sea behind her. The applause came like a wave, warm and wholehearted. Rachel had tears on her cheeks. Daniel clapped hard enough to sting his palms. Michael simply stood still, the corners of his mouth lifting, his eyes on Lily and Duke as if they were the only two beings in the world. When the crowd began to disperse, the 5 of them, Michael, Rachel, Daniel, Lily, and Duke, remained by the rail, watching the sky blaze with the last fire of the sunset. The light gilded the water, the buildings, even the faces beside him, and Michael felt something shift quietly inside him. They weren't bound by blood alone, but by choice, by shared moments of trust and risk and belief. And as the tide whispered against the pier and Duke pressed closer to his leg, Michael understood that sometimes the truest miracle wasn't standing again. It was letting your heart open wide enough to call more than one person, family. Sometimes miracles are not loud or sudden. They come when we open our hearts to love, forgiveness, and faith. If you believe God still works miracles every day, type Amen in the comments. Share this story with someone who needs hope, and subscribe for more true stories that inspire faith and kindness. May God bless you and your family,